Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Tales of Oregon Country, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lakgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'll hand it off.
Well, thank you and welcome on behalf of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, who partners with Jackson County Library Services for this wonderful set of speakers that we have. Today, we're very fortunate to have a very special speaker, Carole Nielson. Carole's accompanied by her husband, Dan, who often performs with her in musical entertainment. Carole is amazing. She's been living in Southern Oregon off and on, but mostly on since 1947. So I was telling her that so many of the things we talk about, she was here when it happened. She is a prolific writer. She's written over 150 articles generally of a historical nature on the Oregon and on the Northwest. Many of them were published in Wild West magazines. She also has published 3 books. Tales of the Oregon Country is her most recent one, which is taking her stories today. 12 short stories of the Oregon West, but another book, 5 Bucks for a Quarter and Notorious Women of the Wild West. We're very much looking forward to having her speak, and with that, I'll turn it over to her.
If you could turn back the calendar a couple of 100 years, Southern Oregon would look very different from what it looks now. There were no housing developments, no highways, no shopping mall, but there were Indian villages, especially along the river. And there were lots of elk herds. Thank goodness the elk are coming back. There were wolves, there were antelope herds. Antelope Road out in White City is named for the antelope herds that were here. There were grizzly bears. There was a pioneer riding on Grizzly Peak east of Ashland. One day he encountered 9 grizzly bears. One of them chased him and got so close that it tore the hair out of his horse's tail. So thank goodness there's no grizzly bears now. But the Indians had it pretty good until the white men came. The Indians that lived here in the valley proper were called Tacoma, and that meant Indians, that meant people living along the river. At the south end of the valley were the Shastas, and if you go a little bit north, there were the Umpquas across the Umpqua Divide, and if you go east, there were the Klamaths and the Modocs. Anyway, the Indians had a lot of good food to eat. There were huge salmon runs on the river and in the creeks. They hunted the elk and the deer, and they ate camas, which is a tuber similar to a potato. And then they would go to the mountains in the summertime and pick huckleberries. Anyway, I have some pictures of some of the Indians that were living here, and my able assistant is going to pass them around for me.
What?
As far as anyone knows, the first recorded white person to enter the Rogue Valley was Peter Steen Ogden. And he worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, which was up in Vancouver, Washington was their headquarters. They're still, Port Vancouver is still up there. And he had an entourage of people with him. Anyway, he had explored over in the Bend area, the Chutes River area, in 1825. And then he came back in 1826 and crossed the Siskiyou Mountains. Now, his group gets credit for naming the Siskiyou Mountains. There's a couple of stories about that. There was an Iroquois Indian in his group, and there was also, they had a bobtail horse. So it's said that the word Siskiyou means bobtailed horse in the Iroquois language. And then other historians say no, it means bobtailed horse in the Tequilma language. And the third story says no, it means bobtailed cat in the Tequilma language. So maybe it means bobtailed something or other, we're not sure. And Peter Skeen Ogden kept a journal and wrote down activities every day. They camped on the river near where Two Bell Park is right now, right across from an Indian village. And he noted that they had a domestic cat in that Indian village. So wonder where the domestic cat came from. They're not indigenous to this area. But there have been ships going up and down the Oregon coast for a couple of 100 years. So the Indians did a lot of trading. So it probably got traded in. It was February when he was here, February 1826. He noted that the weather was very warm for February. So we were having probably a fall spring like we do sometimes. And he noted that it probably got very hot in the summertime. And he was right. So in 1843, the first large wagon train came across the Oregon Trail. There were about 1,000 people in it. And in that wagon train, there were 3 brothers, the Applegate brothers, Charlie Applegate, Lindsay Applegate, and Jesse Applegate. And they all had large families. Now, at that time, when they got to the Dalles, they had to float the Columbia River to get to the Willamette Valley. That's where everybody was headed, for the Willamette Valley. Most of the people would convert their wagons to rafts, and that's what the Applegates did. Now, Jesse, I gotta tell you, Lindsay had his photograph taken, but Jesse refused to ever have his photograph taken, so there's only a sketch of him. But Jesse and Lindsay each had a little boy about 10 years old, and the little guys were cousins. They were real buddies. So they put them on one raft with the hired man, and then each of the men took the rest of their families on another raft. Now, the Columbia River was a wild and dangerous river at that time. So the raft with the 2 little boys and the hired man hit a whirlpool and tipped over, and all 3 of them drowned. Now, Lindsay was going to drop the oars and jump in and try and save his son. And his wife said, if you do that, we'll all drown. So they could do nothing but watch their little boys drown. It was really sad. So both men vowed if they stayed in the Willamette Valley, they were going to find a more southerly, safer route into the Willamette Valley than taking the dangerous Columbia River ride down. So they did stay in 1846. Lindsay and Jesse and Levi Scott. Scott's Mountain up at Crater Lake National Park is named for Levi Scott. And several other men came down through the Rogue Valley, went east, and met a wagon train at Fort Hall, which is in Idaho now. And they persuaded people owning about 200 wagons to follow them on what they called a safer, faster, more southerly route into the Willamette Valley. And traveling in that wagon train was a man named Jesse Quinn Thornton and his wife Nancy. Now, they had been with the Donner Party, and he was a lawyer. Jesse was a lawyer, and he did not like driving a wagon with oxen. So he had talked to one of the people into trading him for a horse for his wagon, and then hauling his supplies. And then eventually he got into a fuss with him, and he caused so much trouble that the Donner Party had kicked him out, he and his wife. Luckily for them, so they hitched up with the Applegates. So now this trail had never been blazed, so it was rough. So they started out and they got in the Black Rock Desert in Nevada. And of course, water was really scarce. The Paiute Indians started harassing them. They would run off their stock if they could. They would shoot their horses or their oxen with poisoned arrows. And a young man named Tanner actually got too far from the wagon train. They killed and scalped him. So Jesse Quinn Thornton started complaining bitterly all the way across. Finally, they made it to the Cascade Mountains. Now, it was a steep climb coming up the Cascades, so they had to double and triple team their wagons to get up the east side. Finally, they got to the top. It was water, wonderful timber. It was a wonderful change from the Black Rock Desert. And then they had to come down the other side over by Ashland, over by Immigrant Lake, Immigrant Creek. And it was so steep coming down that they would drag a log behind their wagon to slow them down, or they would lash a rope around the trees and let the wagons down easily. Finally, there was the beautiful Rogue Valley stretched out before them, about where Ashland is now. And they were tired, their oxen were tired, and Jesse Quinn Thornton suddenly got religion, and he decided they should not travel on Sundays. So the wagon train got dangerously spread out, and Lindsay and Levi Scott tried to urge them on. They said, we've got more mountains to climb. The weather will turn bad. It's getting fall. So finally, they made it to Sexton Mountain, which is just north of Grants Pass. And again, it was so steep, they had to double and triple their wagons, their teams, pull the wagons up one side and lash ropes around to let them down on the other side. Well, as they were coming down into Sunny Valley on the north side of Sexton Mountain, a young lady who was 16 years old within one of the wagons, her name was Martha Leland Crowley, and she died as they were coming down the north side of Sexton Mountain. As far as anyone knows, she is the first white woman to ever die in Southern Oregon. Now, the Crowleys had started out with hopes of making a new life in the Willamette Valley. They had already buried 3 children on the Oregon Trail before they got to Fort Hogg. They had buried a 14-year-old Matilda, a 19-year-old Richard, and 22-year-old Calvin. And now they buried their 4th child, Martha Leland Crowley. They lost her. Calvin was married. His wife, Melissa, was pregnant, and she was riding with the group in the wagon. So there was a young man named David Guthrie in the group, and he and Martha had fallen in love. And he was a carpenter, and he planned to build Martha a home in the Willamette Valley when they got there. Instead, he had to scrounge boards from the different wagons and make her a coffin. And she's buried right near where the covered bridge is in Sunny Valley, right on the banks of the creek there. And it's called Grave Creek because she was buried there. So all 200 wagons rolled over her grave after they buried her, trying to conceal it from the wolves and the Indians. They thought the Indians might dig it up to take her clothes. So finally, that was October the 18th, 1846. The very next day, it started to rain, and it poured every single day. And when they got to Cow Creek up by Glendale, Cow Creek was flooded. When I was a little girl, I came home one November day from school, and my parents and my aunt and uncle were wading out of our cabins in the almost hip deep water because Cow Creek was flooded, carrying our stuff out. So I know how that can be. So they had a struggle, and finally they got to that canyon. As you go to Canyonville, if you go to Seven Feathers, you know what I mean. And when I was little, Old Highway 99 followed the Applegate Trail. So it went through the canyon part of the way and then it went right up over the mountain. And they had a terrible time. When they got to that canyon, it was flooded. There were boulders and trees coming down, and wagons were turning over, oxen were dying. And remember Melissa Crowley? She had her baby inside the wagon while they were trying to go up that canyon. She and the baby both died. People were starving. Their oxen were dying. They were taking chunks of meat off the oxen and trying to eat them raw. And there was a 66-year-old lady named Tabitha Brown. She was traveling with the group. She had her own wagon, but she was traveling with her grown children who had their wagon. And she also was traveling with her very feeble 77-year-old brother-in-law, Mr. Brown. And the children said, why don't you go without your wagon and try to take Mr. Brown and a horse and get up to the top, and we'll catch up with you later. So they gave her 3 strips of bacon and a half a cup of tea leaves and a horse, and she started up the canyon. And Mr. Brown kept falling off the horse, and she tried to get him back on. Finally, they got to the top of the mountain, and she had brought a sheet from her wagon. They sat down in the mud, back to back, and covered themselves with that sheet and sat there for the rest of the night while it poured down rain. Next morning, they saw moccasin tracks all around, but the Indians had observed them, but they hadn't bothered them. Eventually, some more pioneers came along and gave them some food. And now remember, the Crowley family, they've already buried 4 children. Well, Thomas Crowley was the father and Catherine was the mother. When they got to the top of the mountain, Thomas died. They wrapped him in a sheet and they buried him in the mud. Now, Tabitha Brown, when she got to the Willamette Valley, she said the only thing she had left was the clothes on her back, and she found 6 pence in the glove, in the finger of one of her gloves. And she went ahead and founded Pacific University in Forest Grove. Another interesting person traveling in that wagon train was Alfonso Boone and his son. Alfonso was the grandson of Daniel Boone. And his son went on up to the Willamette Valley and eventually started a ferry across the Willamette River. And the town of Wilsonville has grown up around that ferry. And so he was kind of the founder of the town of Wilsonville. That ferry ran until 1955. So there was a girl named Clarissa Fleming who was 17 years old, and she traveled with her family on the Oregon Trail in 1852. Here's her picture, and I'll let my assistant pass that around in a minute. When they got to the Dalles, by 1852, Portland had been established, and there was actually a steamship that went up to the Dalles, and if you had enough money, you could buy passage on it. If not, you could go over the Barlow Road, which had been established in 1846, and it went over the south side of Mount Hood. So her family, James was her father, and he was pretty well off, so they could afford to stay in a hotel in the Dalles. By this time, the Dalles had hotels and restaurants, and they could stay in the hotel and take the steamship down to Portland. But when they were at the Dalles, there was a whole area outside of town where people were trading, and packers and people from the Willamette Valley would come up to do trading with the wagon trains that came in. And they would trade for their skinny cattle that had been walked all the way across the Oregon Trail. And they would trade tools for farming and seeds for planting and things like that. And the language was so rough in that trading area, they didn't even allow women and children to be within hearing distance of it. But James went out to the area and thought he would do some trading. And there was one young man, his name was David Birdseye. He was a quiet, soft-spoken mannerly person. James thought, well, I can do business with him. So they hit it off pretty well. So he invited David to join the family at the hotel that night in the Dalles. And so David came to dinner and he and Clarissa hit it off immediately. So the Flemings made it to Portland. They bought a hotel called the Willamette Inn, and they would have dances and all kinds of festivities at the Willamette Inn. And David, he had a donation land claim down here in Jackson County, and he was a packer and a trader, and he and his uncle had a trading post in Jacksonville. And so David had fallen in love with Clarissa. So he would travel up to Portland every chance he got. And eventually they got married in June of 1853 at the Willamette Inn. And they started for his donation land claim down here in Jackson County. And she rode side saddle all the way from Portland down to Southern Oregon. They camped with Indian villages coming down. David had always kept really good relations with the Indians, and they slept on fir bough beds. And by the time they got to Sunny Valley, there was an inn there that was owned by two men, Bates and Toogood were their name. And Clarissa was so stiff and sore from riding the horse side saddle. David had to help her off the horse, and he thought, well, it would sure be nice to sleep in a regular bed instead of a fir bough bed tonight. So he asked the owners of Bates and Toogood, do you have a bed that we could rent for the night? And they said, well, the only bed they had was their own bed, but they could rent it if they wanted to. So they spent a very uncomfortable night on a lumpy bed. And when they got up the next morning, they had bed bugs, both of them. So they got down to his donation land claim, and actually it might be in Josephine County, I'm not sure. It's on the old Highway 99, and it's between Gold Hill and Rogue River, and it's on let's see, the left-hand side of the road as you go north. Anyway, they got to the donation land claim, and one day Clarissa was cooking dinner over the fireplace, and she heard a ripping sound behind her. Now, they did not have glass windows. Glass was really expensive. It had to be shipped around South America and then brought over by mule train from Crescent City. So nobody could afford glass. So they had what they called isinglass, which was kind of an oiled paper. And so she turned around and there was a slit in the isinglass behind her, and she saw 3 sets of very dark eyes peering through the slit at her. She rushed over to the door and unlatched it. And 3 almost naked Indian men marched in, didn't say a word, went over by the fireplace, sat down, pulled out a packet of what we call, they called it kitty connect. All Indians smoked, and the Indians out here smoked what they called kitty connect. And it was like a mixture of grasses and herbs and things. So they filled their pipe, passed it around, smoked it, got up, said something, and walked out. She ran around back to see where David and a hired man, Bob Mulligan, were back there, and told them about it. And they said, well, they were just passing their approval of you. So anyway, by August, Clarissa was pregnant, and it was a really hot day. So she went out on the porch of the cabin they had, and she was sitting right where the river, the cool breezes would come up from the river, and she was knitting a little garment for her expected baby. And a man came galloping down the road as hard as he could. His hat had blown off, his face was red, his horse was all lathered up, and he was yelling, the Indians are on the warpath. They've killed Dr. Rosenfeld, and they killed some miners and some packers, and no telling who else. And he said, where's David? And she said, he's back there with Bob Mulligan. And he said, well, you better get going. So minutes later, the 3 of them, David and Clarissa and Bob Olgan are riding horses as fast as they could go to Jacksonville. So they stayed in Jacksonville until the things settled down with the Indians, and they decided it was safe enough to come back home. When they were coming back home, they were passing homesteads that were burned to the ground, livestock run off, fences torn down, and they passed 2 Chinese boys hanging in a tree filled full of arrows. And Clarissa was just really terrified at what they were going to find when they got back to their house. And when they got there, everything was just fine. David had always kept good relations with the Indians, and even the horses had been taken care of. This was in 1853, so that was the first Rogue Indian War, they called it. And a little later on, there was another one. So the Indians started getting restless again. So David decided to turn their place into a Fort Birdseye. So they fortified it with upright logs in the perimeter and made the cabin larger so people could stay in it. And they invited all of their neighbors to come in every night and stay in the fort during the Indian troubles. Finally, in 1855, there was the Second Indian War and the Rogue Indian War. And then in 1856, they had removed all of the local Indians to reservations up north, the Grand Ronde and the Slits Reservation. So David and the neighbors built a house in 1856. He had promised Clarissa at some time he would build a house. It's still standing, and it's on the historic register, and it's one of the oldest homes, continuously occupied homes in Southern Oregon. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it. They put it on the historic register in 1972. Anyway, as time went on, David decided that Clarissa might need some help. He was a packer, he was gone quite often. And so he hired a Chinaman. And Clarissa couldn't pronounce his name, so she called him Sam. So one day they were working, it was a hot day, so they had a window open and they were working at a dry sink in front of the open window. And she was trying to teach Sam how to bake a cake. Now, in those days, you know, you didn't have refrigeration or anything, so you had to be careful. My great grandmother taught me you never crack an egg and put it into the batter. You put it into a dish first and then put it into the batter. So she cracked the eggs, and the first 3 were rotten, so she threw them out the window. And from that day forward, whenever Sam baked a cake, he threw the first 3 eggs out the window. One day David said, well, I'm going to go to Grants Pass. By now there was a town at Grants Pass. And he said, do you need anything from town? And she said, well, bring me some seed corn. 2 years later, he came in one night and threw the sack of seed corn in the living room. And she said, where have you been? He said, well, I got to Grants Pass and I heard about a gold strike over in Idaho. So I went over there. And when I got there, I heard about a silver strike over in Montana. So I went over there. And she said, why didn't you write? He said, well, there was really nothing to say. He was a school teacher from Ohio. Anyway, the house was continuously occupied. Their great grandson and daughter-in-law lived in it with their children clear up through the 90s. And in the 90s, it caught fire and partially burned, but they restored it just the way it had been. And unfortunately, just a very few years ago, their great grandson had to sell it, but it's still there. It's still on the historic register if anybody wants to see it. Now, Oregon became a territory in 1848, and it included Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, part of Montana, and part of Wyoming. And our first territorial governor was Joseph Lane. Lane County is named for him. And when he first, by the way, President Polk had offered that position to Abraham Lincoln, and he turned it down because he said, I don't think my wife could stand the wilderness. So Joseph Lane came instead. And so when he first got here, he and the Applegate brothers were good friends. And then they had a falling out because Joseph Lane believed in slavery. In fact, he owned one slave boy. And he not only believed that the blacks should be enslaved, but he thought maybe they should enslave the local Indians. And then when they struck gold in Jacksonville in 1851, influx of Chinese came in. He thought they should be enslaved. Influx of Hawaiians came in. They called them Kanakas. And if you go out in the Applegate, you'll see Kanaka Flats, it's named for them. He thought perhaps they should be enslaved. So they had a real falling out about that. So on October the 8th, 1855, there was a group of miners in Jacksonville. They went from one saloon to the other and got quite drunk. Let's see, I better back up a minute. Joseph Lane invited, he came down and he camped near where Trueville Park is now. And he sent out runners to invite all of the Indians to come for a council and meet on the eastern slope of Lower Table Rock. And this was in 1853, just after the first Rogue Indian War. And he had people come down, the Indian agent, S. Smith from Oregon City and so on. And so hundreds of Indians showed up. And they signed a treaty on September the 10th, 1853. And they gave away all of the Rogue Valley, the Applegate Valley, for $60,000 and a promise of blankets and beef and some medicine in exchange for a reservation that was going to include the two table rocks that go up through Sam's Valley and Evans Valley. And they built Fort Lane on the banks of the Rogue River near where Bear Creek flows in. And the Fort Lane was supposed to protect the Indians from the settlers, and the Indians were all supposed to move to the reservation, which most of them did. So now they're all on the reservation, mostly. And October the 8th, 1855, this group of miners was going from saloon to saloon in Jacksonville and getting quite drunk. And they decided in the middle of the night they were going to ride out to the reservation and kill in some Indians. And their leader was a man named Captain Lupton. And he was a veteran of the Mexican War. He really wasn't an officer, but he, claimed to be. So anyway, they rode out to the reservation and they rode into this village that was headed by a man named the whites called Jake. And it was at the mouth of Little Butte Creek where it flows into the Rogue River. And they rode in the middle of the night and just shot through the wigwams and the wickiups. They were made of sticks and brush. And some people say they killed 20 people. Other sources say they may have killed as many as 80 people. When the young men came home, the young men were all out hunting because Fort Lane was not supplying that beef like they said they were going to, and they were starving, so they were out hunting for deer and elk. And when they came home and found their relatives and friends dead, they went on the warpath. And so they hit Fort Lane first, and then they went on the warpath. And this was on the morning of October the 9th, 1855. And so we come to Mary Ann Harris. She and her husband, George, and their two children had homesteaded. By this time, they had the Homestead Act. They had homesteaded just north of Grants Pass, about where that first rest area is on the right-hand side. You want to pass these around? Anyway, George was out splitting rails, and their hired man, Frank Reed, was cutting firewood a little further out. And they had a cabin there, and it was wash day in the morning. And Mary Ann Harris was out in the front doing the wash. Now, in those days, they had a tripod, a big cast iron kettle, and they boiled the clothes over a fire. And their son, David, who was 10 years old, she had sent him to the garden to dig some potatoes. And their 11-year-old daughter, Sophia, was inside washing up the dishes from morning breakfast. And all of a sudden, George was distracted from splitting his rails, and he looked up and he was pretty much surrounded by Indians, and they had white war paint on, and they were all carrying bows and arrows, and some of them were carrying rifles, and he knew it wasn't good. So he dropped his mallet and started toward the cabin. He grabbed Marianne by the arm and pushed her toward the cabin. He said, "There's going to be trouble, get inside." So just as they got to the door, he grabbed his shotgun, which was setting by the door. The door was open, and whirled toward the open door and got a blast right in the chest. And she helped him to a bed in the corner, slammed the door and barred it. And his dying words were, "You're going to have to defend yourself." So they had an Allen pistol, a Kentucky rifle, and a shotgun. And he had made bullets in advance just in case of something like that. And he had taught Marianne how to shoot. She was a good shot. And he had taught she and Sophia how to make bullets and how to load guns. And so Marianne started shooting and using different guns and shooting in different places, from different places in the cabin, to make the Indians think there were a lot of people in there. And Sophia kept the guns loaded. And they did this all morning and into the afternoon, and it was starting to get dark. In fact, Marianne wounded a couple of the Indians, and she was afraid that they would sneak up in the dark and set the cabin on fire. So when it was just about dusk, she took Sophia by the arm and the Kentucky rifle, and went out to the brush and hid. Now, a bullet had come through the cabin sometime during that day and hit little Sophia in the arm, and the child had not even complained or anything. She just kept loading the guns, and her mother didn't even know she was wounded until she came down and they hid in the brush. So there's hiding in the brush, cuddled up together, terrified, and the wolves start prowling around because they smell the blood. And so they managed to shoo them off. And then Marianne decides she's going to go out to the garden and see if she can find David. And she goes up and down the rows, calling his name quietly. He doesn't answer. She can't find him. So she goes back and huddles the rest of the night in the brush with Sophia. About daylight, she hears some horses coming up the trail. And this is called the Oregon-California Trail, and it runs right where I-5 does now, and it was run right by their cabin, close to their cabin. And she peers out from the brush, and her heart drops. It's more Indians, so she's terrified. A few minutes later, she hears more horses and the rattle of sabers, and it's a cavalry coming from Fort Lane. So she grabs Sophia and they stagger out into the road. By now, her face is black from the black powder shooting. Her hair is a mess. She's got blood on her clothes. Sophia's a mess too. And they're standing there in the road, and one of the soldiers thinks she's an Indian. Now, they've been burying people all the way, all morning long, and finding horrible things, mutilated bodies and so on. Anyway, he raises his gun to shoot, and just as he shot, then a soldier next to him realizes that the white woman, he hits the gun, and the gun goes off and hits right in front of her feet. So they set fire. They buried George underneath the cabin, underneath the floor, and set fire to the cabin. And she saved the Kentucky rifle and the family Bible. They search all over for David. They cannot find him. They cannot find the hired man either. A year later, the hired man's remains were found out in the woods, but they never did find David, not even when the Indians were rounded up and they had some white captives, so they never knew what happened to him. Now, when that Indian War broke out, there was an Indian named Umpqua Joe who lived over just on the river just south of Grants Pass. And instead of siding with the Indians, he and his wife got into separate canoes and went down the river below Grants Pass, yelling, "Ford up, Ford up, the Indians are on the warpath." And they figure they saved probably tons of lives of miners and settlers by warning them. So by the time they got down to Belize, Quadjo and his wife forded up with the miners there and helped defend the fort. He was a good shot, and she helped load the guns. So when they rounded up the Indians and sent them to the reservations up north, because Quadjo had helped so much, they let he and his wife stay and created the smallest Indian reservation in the world. And it's where Indian Mary Park is now. Eventually, they turned it into a park. He established a ferry there across a river, and he ferried miners and settlers back and forth until his death. And then after he died, his daughter, and they called her Indian Mary, and his granddaughter lived there, and she took over the ferry and ran it until her death. So if you go to Indian Mary Park, you'll see as you go in, you'll see a picture of them. And Quadjo said white people would hide and watch him because they thought he had a gold mine. So there's a steep hill right behind the park, and he would climb that, and then he'd dance around this big flat rock and mumble some things, and then he'd hide in the brush and watch them look for his gold mine. So when we had the gold strike in California, the Chinese heard about it as soon as people on our own East Coast heard about it. And of course, they came by the thousands to participate in the gold rush. And then when it was discovered up here in 1851, then the Chinese started pouring into Southern Oregon. And we were a prejudiced area, and we charged any Chinese $50 just for being here. And if they went into business, they were charged $5 a month. That was a lot of money in then. A man named Jin Lin showed up in Southern Oregon in 1860. Now, it was illegal to sell a working gold mine to a Chinaman, but somehow he acquired a played out mine, and he introduced hydraulic mining. And he banked over $1 million in gold in the Beekman Bank in Jacksonville. And from time to time, he would leave and go down to San Francisco and bring back a new, younger wife. He would buy her the fanciest clothes in San Francisco. He would come up to Jacksonville and squire her all over town in a fancy buggy and give his old wife to one of his men. One day he drew all of his money out of the Beekman Bank and went to San Francisco and bought passage back to China. By this time he had a little boy also. And some stories say as soon as he got off the ship, he was beaten and robbed and killed. But other stories say that he lived to a ripe old age and enjoyed his money. I like that story better. And actually his son did come back to Southern Oregon for a little bit. Now, in 1869, there was a farmer named Bruce Greaves. He lived just over the line in Northern California, and he had a herd of cattle, and a young grizzly killed one of his heifers. Now, he knew that grizzlies always came back for a second meal, so he set a trap there by the dead heifer, and sure enough, the young grizzly came back and got caught in the trap. But he chewed off 3 of his toes. So from then on, he had a very distinctive track. And people called him Real Foot. Some people called him Clubfoot, but Real Foot stuck. That grizzly roamed from Northern California almost to Crater Lake, and back and forth, and its favorite haunt was on the Siskiyous. For the next 20 years, he killed hundreds of head of livestock. So they would try and and they always knew his trap because it was so distinctive. And it's rumored that he even killed 2 Klamath Indians and ate them. So they would set traps for him, and they'd set a trap under a tree and hang a piece of meat in the tree. And instead of stepping in the trap, he would go behind the tree, pull the meat around, and eat it. And he never returned a second time to a kill. The first time, and that was it. And they even put set guns so that it would go off. He'd get the meat, the gun would go off, and he'd never get shot. And so they put a bounty of $500 on his head. That was a lot of money then. So there was a man named William Wright who owned a little ranch up on the Siskiyous, just on the Oregon side. And one day he was out, in one April day, he was out fixing his fence. And a ways away in the meadow, his cows were grazing, and he saw a big grizzly come charging out of the timber, rushed over to the meadow and killed his best bull. So he waited quite a while, and hid, and waited until he knew that the grizzly had left. And he ran to his cabin and grabbed his gun, and then he ran down the creek to the neighbors. The Beans lived down the creek, and they had a son, Pearl Bean. He was 17 years old, and he owned a Winchester repeating rifle, and he was an excellent shot. And he said, "Let's go get that bear and collect that bounty." So they started out tracking him. Now they tracked that bear all the way almost to Crater Lake. And they camped down one night, and when they got up, they started out again. They found that the bear had killed a cow about a quarter of a mile from him. Luckily, never bothered him. But they tracked him all the way back to the Siskiyous. And on April the 10th, 1890, they came around a draw, and there, about 80 yards away across a shallow ravine, was old Reelfoot. And he hadn't quite caught their scent yet, so they tied up their nervous horses and grabbed their guns and came out. And by this time, he'd caught their scent. He stood on his hind legs and growled, and then dropped on all fours, and with his ears laid back and his teeth snapping and coming at him. And they started shooting, and they shot, and they shot, and they shot. And finally, about 30 yards away, he dropped. And Bill Wright said to Carole that don't go up to him yet. He may not be dead. So they waited a few minutes, and pretty soon he got up and started for him again. And they started shooting again. And he was coming fast. And Carole said, "Well, maybe we should climb a tree." And Bill Wright said, "No, that our best chances is to stand here and shoot." Finally, 20 feet from them, he dropped dead. He weighed 1,892 pounds. His claws were 4.5 inches long. From his nose to his tail, he was 8 feet, and they estimated that when he stood on his hind legs, he was between 11 and 12 feet high. They found 10 bullet holes in him, and they dug out a quart jar of lead out of his hide. They had him mounted and put on a wagon, and they paraded him through Jacksonville, Ashland, and Wairika, and then they paraded him across the United States, and even took him to the Chicago World's Fair. And Pearl Bean sold his half to Bill Wright for $300. And then they're not sure what happened to him. They think that he was sold to the Sons of the Golden West, and maybe mounted and was in the lobby of a hotel in San Francisco, and was probably destroyed in the great earthquake in San Francisco fire of 1906. However, some soldiers returning from Europe after World War I said they had seen him over there in a museum. And so all of the major museums were contacted, and nobody seemed to have him. So remember those 3 toes he chewed off? Well, Bruce Greaves donated those to the museum in Wairika, and they were there for a long time, and then somebody broke into the museum and stole those. So all we have left are photos of old Reelfoot. Now we come to Huckleberry Alice, and I actually knew her. She was born in 1885 over in Keno, and her mother was a Klamath Indian, and her father was white. And she started going to Huckleberry Mountain as a baby in her mom's in a cradle board on her mom's back. Now, if you look at old Forest Service maps, you'll see just a little bit south west of Crater Lake National Park, a place called Huckleberry City. For thousands of years, the Indians went up there from all areas and picked huckleberries and made pemmican out of it. They pound them and mix them with jerky and dried salmon, and they heat for the winter, and they called it pemmican. So when the summers came, they started going there too, and they pitched so many tents, they called it Huckleberry City. And they loved to dance, and they'd stay for weeks, and they canned their huckleberries right there or dry them. And so they built it, they danced, and it created so much dust that they finally built a dance hall. And then they had a floor, and they had a roof on it of fir boughs. And Huckleberry Alice played the fiddle, and she played the accordion, and so she entertained, and they danced. And one woman, even I interviewed her, she was almost 100 years old. She used to take her milk cow up and sell milk and butter all over camp, and even make fudge and sell that. Huckleberry Alice always had two tents, one cooking tent and one for sleeping, and she'd take her feather beds up too, by the way. And one night she heard a commotion over in the cooking tent, and she got her gun and went over there, but she had a little dog that went with her, and there was a bear in the cooking tent going through things. So she shot, but that little dog jumped up and hit her gun, and just as she shot it, she blew off her big toe. And they rushed her down the Shady Cove where I lived to Doc Ferguson. They bandaged her up and told her she needed to go home and stay off her feet for a while, but she was right back on the mountain the next morning. So she went to Huckleberry Mountain every year for over 85 years and became a legend on the mountain. And so that's our program.